It's hard to consider that if there's not ambition to cut emissions and to provide the means of implementation for agreements in the form of finance, transfer of technology, and capacity building before 2020, there's no confidence building that it will take place after 2020 either. The whole process is cast in doubt when one sees that there was a second commitment period for Kyoto approved in Durban. Then the second commitment period for Kyoto was approved again in Doha. We're 1 year later, and there's no ratification by the European countries who had been lobbying vigorously, both in Durban and in Doha, for the second commitment period to Kyoto. The initial fast start finance did not reach most places, Nicaragua included. There is no roadmap for the supposed goal of 100 billion beginning in 2020. We're in the midst of a lost decade that stretches from 2009 to 2019 without global climate action and without global climate finance. The Green Climate Fund was created in Durban. I served on the transition committee that organized the Green Climate Fund. Subsequent to that, a year has been passed with a board of directors working on organizing the fund. The Republic of Korea has offered it abode and some startup financing for the administrative side. The Federal Republic of Germany has a commitment for $50 million. Here we are 3 years after Cancun, and there's one country that's contributing to the fund that would be used for actually financing, and that's the Federal Republic of Germany. That's pathetic. We really don't see action with regard to means of implementation. And it's irresponsible to continue approving documents that don't have means of implementation. So here we are at a juncture in which there are great moral and historical quandaries afoot, because this is a very bad decade to have a lost decade, because we see the knocks on the door, Sandy hitting New York last year, this Haiyan or Yolanda hitting the Philippines and Vietnam this year, the International Energy Agency saying that the 2 degrees in this century is lost, and that we should prepare ourselves for scenarios between 3.5 and 6 degrees. You know, this 2 degrees is a worldwide average. Even 2 degrees is 3.8 degrees in Central America in terms of the geographical distribution. And that's catastrophic for many of our crops, many of our foodstuff crops, and for our prime export product, which is coffee. So this has consequences, huge consequences, and this is where you see the moral and historical responsibilities that must be borne by those who are letting this decade slip away, or very intentionally just sliding, kicking the can down the road, rather than coming to terms with these really important issues for the future of humanity. Quite fortunately, the world is not sitting by with its arms crossed, waiting for the global area, for the global level, for the negotiations and this process to come to a conclusion. And many things are happening locally. So, for example, Nicaragua is transforming its energy matrice from 25% renewable energy in 2007 to 90% renewable energy by 2020, with a mix of hydroelectric, geothermal, wind, solar, and geomass projects, financed by $2.9 billion in direct foreign investment. We really don't understand the debate on a private sector window in the Green Climate Fund of mobilizing private sector finance within the convention, because I don't know what private sector that is. The private sector that we know, when it sees a bankable project, it finances it. There's been no intermediation for the $2.9 billion in foreign direct investment that's transforming the energy matriz in Nicaragua. Where we need public investment is on the adaptation side. There's some small niches where there could be private investment there, like finding varieties of coffee that are more resilient to heat and low precipitation and to the diseases that coffee plants suffer. But in the aftermath of Haiyan, we need public financing. We need a loss and damages mechanism, which was approved in Doha. We now need to see come out of this meeting an operational mechanism for losses and damages to help countries like the Philippines who are suffering the consequences of a situation that the Filipino people did not create across the centuries and are not contributing to in any major way today, but who are suffering the consequences of the global warming and of the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events.
Can I ask you then, what can you realistically do at these talks? It's clear, listening to delegates from the USA, from the EU, that while they may consider and discuss a loss and damage mechanism, it's not going to be the kind of climate compensation scheme that many countries want. And when we talk about finance and emission reductions, that seems like there's nothing going to turn up in these next week. So what can you do, apart from rail against the lack of ambition? What practically can groups like ALBA and other negotiating teams do at these talks?
Well, we need to get a global agreement by 2015. To get this global agreement by 2015, both sides have to put things on the table. Both sides have to concede some things. There has to be a give and take. So as we approach 2015, maybe there is some leverage coming into the final negotiations so that the developed countries realize that they have a moral and historical responsibility to start taking this issue far more seriously than has been the case after Copenhagen. Copenhagen demonstrated that the voluntary approach does not work. The Copenhagen Accord was never approved by COP15. It was just taken note of. But they proceeded in the UN system to implement it as if it had been approved, and what that achieved was to demonstrate the failure of the voluntary approach. The voluntary emission cuts are a failure. Japan's recent cut is a demonstration of that. The voluntary financing is a failure. The initial Fast Start funds failure is a demonstration of that also. We need a legally binding agreement. We had a legally binding agreement in Kyoto that wasn't universal. We now need a universal, legally binding agreement that is within the convention, and which respects the principles of Rio, reiterated in Rio +20, including differentiated responsibilities, common but differentiated responsibilities. And we need the concept of historical responsibility. There are three major issues here: historical responsibility, the current situation with regard to the emission of greenhouse gases, and the tendency, whether the tendency and the commitments are for reduction, to stay flat, or even increase, which is now on the cards, as we're seeing.
Final question, just in terms of Japan's announcement and Australia's announcement earlier this week, what effect does that have on negotiations? What effect does that have on private closed meetings and the atmosphere in those?
Well, I would say that, for example, we in Nicaragua had to face the reality of climate change refugees. A 1,000-house human settlement was created called the Dignity Village, Villa Dignidad, near Managua, for refugees who can't return to their homes because of recurrent flooding. We had to do this with national funding. There was no international funding available. I think that at the same time, we had some funding through the Petrocaribe mechanism. Some of the new mechanisms in the South are starting to take shape. What we need to do in the negotiations with our partners is to really emphasize the need for them to fulfill their commitments and to emphasize that we see no way to assume further commitments if they continue to not assume their commitments. So this is the case with regard to emissions. This is the case with regard to the financing, which is contemplated within the convention. And this is the case with this loss and damage mechanism, which is quite urgent. I think that that will come to pass. It'll come to pass on the back of great human suffering. It will happen sooner or later. Let's hope it's sooner with less suffering. But there's a lot of false economies here too. The International Energy Agency tells us in its World Energy Outlook 2011 that for every dollar not spent on renewable energy before 2020, it will be necessary to spend $4.30 subsequently in a greatly deteriorated situation. This is not rational. This is not rational what's happening in this decade. So I would hope that civil society, that the environmental movement realize the role that they should be playing in elevating consciousness in their societies, that the policies that are being pursued at the global level are just not going to cut it, and we're all going to pay the consequences of that unless we get some action in the course of this decade.